What's going on, guys, and welcome back to this week's Bourbon of the Week. Today we have Thomas S. More. Now, if you don't know, this is basically a Sazerac product, Buffalo Trace product, aka a Barton product. So if you know about 1792, they take the 1792 mash bill and they finish it, and that's what Thomas S. More gives us. They have three different finishes. This is the what's it called? Cabernet Sauvignon. French stuff. I don't know how to say it. Cabernet Sauvignon. Sounds fancy. So that's what we're drinking on, but everybody knows before we get started on any of that, time for the traditional sip. That's sweet. So first off, shout out Sixers, big win last night, but this is Thomas S. More. This is basically the Barton 1792 line. We have the 1792 small batch, which is one of my favorites, obviously an empty bottle here. We also have the full proof and the single barrel up top there. 1792 puts out a great product. I usually have a backup bottle. I actually just ran out of that not too long ago. But this is basically the same mash bill, which is an undisclosed mash bill, somewhere in that 15 to 20% rye range. But it's the same mash bill, and then they finish it in these wine barrels. They have three different wine barrels, the port, Chardonnay, and then I'm going to try again, Cabernet Sauvignon, whatever it's called. Cabernet Sauvignon. We're just going to call it wine barrels from now on. They finish it in the wine barrels, which gives you a whole different tasting experience that we're going to get to in taste. But for this is 95.3 proof, and the drinkability on this is where we're going to start, which is decent, I guess. It's not terrible. I think it hides very well behind the sweetness on this, but at the same time, you do pick up a little bit of an ethanol kick with this, which is what we're talking about when we do drinkability. How much ethanol does it have? How much of a alcohol kick do you get off this? And for under 100 proof, it definitely has a pretty good kick. I don't think it's too terrible. Again, I think they do a very good job of hiding behind the sweetness on this that you're going to pick up from those wine casks. But at the same time, it's definitely there. It's definitely still prevalent. And for being under 100, I would probably guess that this was about 100 proof if I drank it. So you're talking less than a 5 proof difference in what I think it is and what it actually is. Again, it's not terrible, but it's really not the best. I think they could definitely get that drinkability down a little bit more. The small batch 1792, I know that the drinkability on that wasn't fantastic as well. I think the high rye really gives it a little bit of a kick as well. But this, for drinkability, let's give this I'm going to give it like an 8.1 when it comes to drinkability. And again, I think it hides pretty well behind the sweetness, but at the same time, you can definitely still pick up that alcohol note. You get a little bit of the aroma on it as well when doing a little nosing here. So 8.1 is where I'm going to put it for now. So that's going to bring us into taste on this, and that's where it's really going to differentiate itself from the 1792 lineup. Because this is finished in the wine barrels, it's going to open up a whole different flavor profile that you don't get from their original bourbon. This is going to give it dark fruit notes. This Cabernet Sauvignon is really dark fruit forward. It's going to be plum, blackberry, black cherry, all types of that. You're still going to get vanilla out of this wine, and you're still going to get, interestingly enough, licorice, which is the one flavor that I don't like in this that we'll get to in a second. And then it still has black pepper, and it still has that oaky slash, tobacco and leather as well when you're talking about just the wines. So putting all of those flavor profiles into the bourbon, you're really mixing some pretty similar flavor profiles. When you're talking about a high rye, you get that black pepper. You're talking about aged in New American charred oak, so you're going to get that wood, that leather, maybe a little bit of that tobacco note. For this, I don't get the tobacco and the leather as much, but you 100% pick up these dark fruit notes. The plum, you get a little bit of burnt marshmallow on this when you first nose this bourbon. And it's very, very sweet forward, very friendly almost when it comes to the flavor profiles. But then it gets into that licorice note very heavy, and I don't like that. Gets into almost like this bitter taste at the end. Very dry on the end, and it doesn't last very long as well. So it's kind of like a roller coaster of flavors that you're getting into. Very good, very sweet on the beginning. Not even that much of a rye kick that you're expecting from the 1792, being that 15 to 20% rye. But at the same time, then it comes crashing back down at the end here when you're picking up that licorice, that very dry, very short finish. So it's like you want to it starts out so nice, and then it kind of just fades away into the darkness, and it's kind of hard to figure out. Every time you take a sip, you're getting, the sweet notes, but then you take another sip and you get licorice, and you're like, oh, I don't like this. This is kind of right in the middle of the road for me. And I want to say average is like those 7 ranges, but like lately as I've been doing more and more of these, I can't put everything in the 7s. I would put this below average when it comes to my personal preference on taste. Again, you would definitely like this if you're more of a wine drinker. I'm not a wine drinker. I don't drink wine for a reason. I drink bourbons. I'm not the biggest finished guy when it comes to my bourbons either. Angel's Envy isn't a big one for me. I know everybody loves the Angel's Envy in port wine finished bottles or port wine finished casks. Something about a finished bourbon that just it doesn't really excite me as far as the bourbon world goes. It's not what I'm looking for in a bourbon. Now this has a very niche following. If you like wine and you like bourbon, then try them out together, don't get me wrong, but at the same time for me, it's just not it. I'm going to give this like a 6.2 when it comes to taste on this. And of course, as you know, last but not least, that's going to get us into price on this, and you're not going to like to hear this one. These come in, this was actually a behind the shelf purchase, which surprised me after I started doing a little bit of research on it. I wouldn't say they're very hard to find. I guess they're kind of a limited release, but at the same time in Pennsylvania, this is a behind the shelf purchase, and at $70, $69.99 MSRP. That's a lot of money to pay. Now, why are we paying that amount of money? Again, we're getting the Barton 1792 bottle, which I think is like, what, 35 bucks? And then they're obviously finishing this in the wine barrel, so they have to purchase the wine barrels. They have to keep it in there for another, it says 1 to 3 years, but on the back of this particular bottle, it says, and I quote, "This well-aged Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey was emptied from its oak casks after many years of aging and then refilled in the Cabernet Sauvignon wine casks, left to mature for several more years." So several obviously means more than one. I'm guessing it's up in that 2 to 3 year range if they're going to say several. So when you're talking about one, a high rye mash bill from 1792, two, the fact that they have to buy the wine barrels to put these in, and then three more years of aging, I understand why it's costing money. That's obviously a lot of production, a lot of time, and a lot of value that they put in making these bottles. But for me, the value isn't quite there. It's not that great of a taste. Again, this is all personal preference, because when you start to finish things, if you don't like wine, then why are you going to get something that's finished in a wine barrel? I know that's what you're thinking, Chris, you're an idiot. Don't buy things finished in wine barrels if you don't like wine. I agree with you. I don't disagree with you at all. This one's just not for me. If you do like Cabernet Sauvignon, I can't even say the word, let alone drink the wine. If you do like that, you'll probably love this. You get a lot of those flavors that you would get in a wine. It definitely tones down the bourbon flavors and tones up the sweetness on this, especially when you're talking about a high rye mash bill. So all of that being said, I'm going to give my opinion on what I think it's worth, and $70 isn't it. I'm going to give this like a, let's give it like a 5.5 when it comes to price, and that's one of the lower scores I've given. So while I add these scores up for you, let's send it over to this week's Bourbon Bomb of the Week, which we're going to keep short. Let's do this. So for this week's Bourbon Bomb of the Week, we're going to go over finished bourbons and also the barreling process in general. So this goes all the way back to Scotland when they make scotch. Now back in the day, they used to drink scotch right out of the still, but at the same time, they would make a lot of it, so they would have to store it. And what would they store it in? Obviously, they would put it in barrels because one, it was easy to transport, and two, you could hold a lot of it in a barrel. Well, they were getting these barrels, and they could have bought these barrels off of any type of company. Maybe there was fish in it, maybe there were guts from animals in it. It didn't matter what was in it. They were buying the barrels because they were cheap. And this is why we get a lot of the rules and regulations on why it's got to be new American charred oak. So what they did is, because they would have fish or guts or any type of things in these barrels, they would burn them, and that would basically make them clean, and they would clean out these barrels by burning them. Then they realized that when they were traveling, if they traveled for a longer distance and they were in these barrels for a longer period of time, they became more desirable. People liked the flavor a little bit more from these charred oak barrels that they had, rather than coming out of something that had fish guts in it. Who would have thought? Well, at that time, sherry casks became very cheap. They were very readily available. Wine was selling quickly, so they had a lot of extra sherry casks, and some of these companies actually started putting their bottles, bourbons, whiskeys at the time, the scotches, I guess, because they weren't quite bourbons yet, they would put them in these sherry casks, and people started to love this. This is when the finishing process got started. They would take the white dog out of the still, they would put it into these casks, and people loved the flavors that they were getting out of this. So that's where finishing actually got its start from. That's why barreling and bottling and all of this stuff is so important. Bottled and Bond Act is important for all of this type of stuff with aging. And that's why we have all these rules and regulations, because it went from fish guts to new American charred oak to finished bottles. And that's what we have right here. Quick little history of why we barrel things the way we do today. And that's what we've got. Thomas S. Moore, finished in Cabernet, you get it. So there you have just a little bit of the history behind barreling and the finishing process and why we do it today. And again, if you're a big wine fan, they do this stuff in cognac barrels, they do rum, they do tequila, all kinds of stuff that people are trying to figure out the best flavor profile to go along with bourbon. But for me personally on this one, this is going to get a 6.6, which is a little bit lower on the scale. But at the same time, at that price point and what you're getting here in this bottle, I think it's a fair spot for it. But that's going to be it for this week. Make sure you check me out on Instagram at Bourbon of the Week. Every Tuesday at 4 p.m. we drop an image of the bourbon that we're going to review. You can go on and try and guess the score that I'm going to give it. If you guess the closest, I'll shout you out on the channel as well as enter you in a monthly drawing for some pretty cool prizes. Check me out on Patreon and Discord, both links down below. But in the meantime, don't drink and drive. Drink responsibly. Stay healthy, stay happy, stay drinking. Cheers, y'all.